if I told you that money was never meant to make you free? That the bills in your wallet, the coins in your pocket, the numbers glowing on your banking app were not invented to make life easier, but to bind you? Most of us are taught a simple, comfortable story. Once upon a time, people bartered. A goat for some grain, a jar of honey for a pair of sandals. Barter was clumsy, so people invented money. Coins and notes came along, and suddenly trade was smooth, fair, efficient. But that story is a myth. The truth is darker. Money was not invented to simplify trade. It was invented to control populations, to fund wars, and to create a cycle of debt that would last for generations. Debt has been humanity's invisible chain for over 5,000 years. It has toppled empires, sparked revolutions, and reshaped the fate of nations. And even now, it quietly governs our lives more than we realize. This is the secret history of debt. Let's go back to the beginning. In Mesopotamia, around 3,000 years before the Common Era, society flourished along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Cities rose, temples towered, and writing was invented. But with civilization came the first great debt systems. And here's the twist. Money didn't come first, debt did. The great temples of Mesopotamia were not just houses of worship, they were banks. Farmers in need of seed grain or herders looking to expand their flocks would borrow from the temple. 100 bushels of barley borrowed in spring meant 120 owed at harvest. If the rains failed, if the crops withered, the debt remained. And when repayment became impossible, families paid with the only collateral they had, themselves. Husbands, wives, and children fell into debt bondage, laboring for creditors to pay off impossible sums. Debt had become a chain. But the kings of Mesopotamia understood a dangerous truth. If debts piled too high, society collapsed. Too many peasants enslaved, too much land in the hands of creditors, and revolts became inevitable. So, kings occasionally issued debt jubilees, wiping the slate clean, canceling debts, freeing slaves. These weren't acts of mercy. They were acts of survival.
From the very beginning, debt wasn't just economics. It was political. It was a system of control, carefully managed to avoid rebellion. Fast forward to 600 years before the Common Era. In the small kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Turkey, the first coins appeared. Why coins? The easy explanation is trade. The real explanation was war. A king who wanted soldiers needed to pay them, but peasants had no reason to accept little metal discs, so rulers demanded taxes in those coins. Suddenly, everyone needed them. Farmers, craftsmen, and merchants all had to work, trade, or sell goods to acquire coins, or risk punishment. The peasants scrambled to earn currency, and in doing so, they created the economy that rulers needed. Soldiers were paid in coins, spent them in local markets, and spread currency throughout society. Coins were not invented to make life fairer. They were invented to raise armies and force populations into obedience. The Roman Empire perfected this logic. Roman coins bore the emperor's face, not just currency, but propaganda. Conquered lands were taxed in Roman coins, compelling entire provinces to join Rome's economy. Those who failed to pay lost their land, and the wealthy elite bought up estates worked by indebted peasants. Once again, money, debt, war, and control marched hand in hand. After Rome collapsed, Europe entered the Middle Ages. Coins grew scarce. Most peasants lived in a world of barter and informal credit, yet debt never vanished. The church forbade usury, the charging of interest, but debt lived on in shadows. Jewish moneylenders, banned from land ownership, filled the vacuum. Kings borrowed heavily to fund wars, then often expelled their lenders rather than repay them. Debt was more than financial. It was moral. Preachers thundered against usury, peasants revolted against crushing tax burdens, and debt became the fault line between rulers and ruled. But as Europe awoke from the Middle Ages, Banking families, like the Medici in Florence and the Fuggers in Germany, reshaped the world. Usury laws bent. Credit flowed openly. Vast sums funded wars, voyages of discovery, even the Renaissance itself. Debt had been normalized. It wasn't sin anymore. It was the lifeblood of states. And ordinary people carried the cost. Through taxes, through inflation, through endless labor to service loans they never agreed to. By the 18th century, the pressure was unbearable. France borrowed endlessly to fund wars and royal excess. By the 1780s, the monarchy owed more money than it could ever repay. Taxes crushed the poor, while the wealthy nobility slipped free. The result was revolution. The French Revolution, remembered for liberty and equality, was also about debt. The system had reached breaking point. It couldn't bend any further. And France wasn't alone. The American Revolution, too, was about money and debt. Britain, buried in loans from its imperial wars, taxed the colonies mercilessly. The cry of no taxation without representation was at its heart about refusing to pay the empire's debts. Debt lies in the shadows of every great revolution. When the burden grows too unbearable, people rise up. By the 19th century, debt had become something new. Governments didn't hide their borrowing. They flaunted it. National debts became permanent. Bonds tied the wealth of the future to the demands of the present. And banks developed the most powerful trick of all, creating money from nothing. When you borrow today, the bank isn't handing you someone else's savings. It is conjuring new money with a keystroke, then binding you with interest. The chain has been perfected. The Great Depression of the 1930s revealed the devastation of this machine when it fails. Millions lost jobs, homes, and farms, all because debts could not be repaid. The world economy collapsed under the weight of its own obligations. After the Second World War, a new system rose. Bretton Woods. World currencies were tied to the US dollar, and the dollar to gold. It was a promise of stability. But in 1971, President Nixon ended that link. Money was no longer tied to gold. It was tied to nothing. From that moment, debt became limitless. Governments borrowed endlessly. Corporations borrowed to inflate stock prices. Consumers borrowed to buy homes, cars, education, even groceries. Debt was no longer part of the system. Debt was the system. And that brings us to today. Global debt now surpasses $300 trillion, more than 3 times the size of the world economy. In the United States alone, households owe over $17 trillion. Mortgages, student loans, credit cards, medical bills, the chains are everywhere. And just like in Mesopotamia, rulers fear collapse. That's why we see student debt forgiveness debated, trillion-dollar bailouts approved, interest rates manipulated. The system knows it cannot let the chains grow too heavy, or revolt follows. Meanwhile, new forms of money are emerging. Digital currencies issued directly by central banks. They promise efficiency, security, and convenience, but they also carry unprecedented power. Imagine money that can expire if you don't spend it. Imagine transactions tracked in real time. Imagine a system where your money can be turned off with the press of a button. Is that freedom? Or is that the oldest trick in the book, reborn for the digital age? What lessons can we take from this long history? First, debt has always been political. It is not simply numbers in a ledger. It is a relationship of power binding ordinary people to rulers, empires, and banks. Second, every debt system has a breaking point. Ancient jubilees, medieval revolts, modern revolutions. When the chains grow too tight, societies shatter. And third, this cycle is accelerating. What once took centuries now unfolds in decades. With digital money and limitless credit, the chains are faster, tighter, and more invisible than ever. They told us money was freedom, that credit was opportunity, that debt was the price of progress. But history tells a different story. Money was invented not to liberate us, but to control us. Debt was designed not as a tool of progress, but as a chain of power. And unless we recognize that truth, the cycle will continue. Debt, control, collapse, rebirth. The question is not how much you owe. The question is how much you are willing to accept before the next breaking point arrives. If you found this history eye-opening, share it with someone who still believes money was invented to make life easier. And remember, to understand the future of money, you must first uncover its past.